Kia ora tātou, ka nui te mihi kia tātou I tēnei wā. So it's my pleasure to stand in on this panel for Kerry. And also to welcome our panelists to the session on upholding Indigenous rights in trade and free trade agreements. And we're very blessed to have two amazing speakers who are going to share their thoughts and ideas and wisdom and extol the virtues of all of our indigeneity and wonderful things that they're going to share with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves and also just to, if you'd like to sort of address a few key questions about what is sort of, Indigenous rights and how are they sort of protected in free trade agreements at this time. Yeah, kia ora. So we're going a bit off script, so we'll open up to you.
Hello, everybody. First, I'd like to, my name is Risa Schwartz. I'm a lawyer from Canada working in international trade, international environmental law, and the intersections with Indigenous rights. I identify as a settler, potentially more of a migrant. My background is Jewish, and so my family is somewhat new to Canada as well. My grandparents came over from Poland in the middle of the First and the Second World War. I started I'll give just a 2-minute background of how I started working in this area, because it's always interesting to find yourself. This is a new space, and I think and I'm not sure how many young people are in the audience that are starting to think about areas that they should focus on for their careers, but I think this is definitely a growing one. When I started my work, it was much more of a focus on environmental law, and climate change is a big motivator for me early on, and I think unfortunately we're starting to see the effects now. I'm actually more than happy to be here today, not only for the wonderful invitation and learning all about Indigenous trade from a Māori perspective, but also because my country is burning. So the air quality in Toronto today is the worst in the world. I'm actually concerned about my parents, who are elderly, and my small dog, who I left home. It's been like this off and on, not summer, earlier than summer, because our summer started in May. Usually May is just starting to get warm. This year, May was hot, and that's why Canada is on fire. The smoke is affecting all the way to Europe, down to the United States. And when it's like that, and I'm sure people from Australia know what it's like that you can't go outside. So we're stuck in our homes in the only nice weather that we get. I draw this, I want to make this point. I think it's important because it really was the motivating factor to take my environmental law experience and start looking at ways to fix some of the structures that I feel are broken from an equity perspective, as we've discussed, but also broken from a people perspective that has also been mentioned yesterday. And when we're talking about people, when we're talking about environment, we're talking about people. And I think that's sometimes lost as well. So trade is important for people. Trade creates these connections. I think trade brings us together, but trade has, something's been lost over the last 50 years where the wealth from trade has gone to too few. It's left out many from the economy. It's certainly left out Indigenous peoples. And with that, what we're also losing is our planet. So my hope is the focus on Indigenous trade also brings the focus back to a more nature-focused worldview. And I think it's very important to have that perspective. And now I will plug the work that Kerry and I have just done. We just co-authored a piece looking at the IPECTA, the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Arrangement, which is, I think, the first agreement really, it's an arrangement, so it's non-binding, but everything interesting in international law starts off as non-binding. I think we focus sometimes on, it's not a treaty. Right now, Canada's implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The action plan just came out earlier this week. So we, as a country, are implementing a non-binding declaration. So I also hope that we'll be implementing a non-binding trade arrangement, starting to take some of those important, and I think it's either Article 2 or Article 3 that speaks to Indigenous worldviews, really influenced by Maori. But what I found sort of as an outsider sitting in with my clients, mostly First Nations, was how there was so much agreement between the worldviews. Not much argument. Concepts in one language really resonated with another language. Someone would say, oh yes, I have a word for that in Mohawk. Or the Anishinaabe say this. Which was beautiful to see as someone sitting back. But I think it should speak to all of us. And I really feel that this is why I do this work, why I love this work, and why I hope not only will there be opportunities and benefits for economic success, but also protecting cultures, way of life, and building those relationships to help our planet.
Kia ora, thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, kei te tautoko o ngā mihi kua mihia i tēnei ata. He uri o Te Aroa me Ngāti Awa e mihi ana kia koutou, ko Maria Bargh tōku ingoa. Kia ora everybody, Maria Bargh, lovely to be here. Yes, so we were going to begin with a little bit of background.
Yes.
I'm going back to the notes that we were following previously. And I think that will give you a sense of where my comments are coming from. My original research in this area, well, I was involved with the Māori Students Association back in the 1990s, late 1990s, and as part of that I worked for Te Mana Akonga, the National Māori University Students Association, and was sent 1 year largely by Annette Sykes, who was here yesterday, unfortunately not here today, with some others to a meeting in Geneva of the People's Global Action Against Free Trade and the World Trade Organization. And there we participated in the meetings, and in particular an Indigenous caucus with people from the Zapatistas from Mexico, who were at that time at the very forefront of rejecting NAFTA and the policies that they could see impacting them there. And those from Ecuador, Kuna from Panama lands, other Indigenous peoples who talked about the very real impacts of trade agreements. And I think that was what struck me, particularly when I came home, was to try and keep making these connections. A lot of, I went to a few marae meetings in Hapu Hui, tried to get my whanaunga at Ngāti Kia, Ngāti Tuara inspired, but it's making those connections between the very specific real things, and a lot of my more recent work's in the environmental area, and I'll talk about that, and those kinds of impacts from these sorts of agreements. After that, my PhD research was on trade deals in the Pacific, the PACER and the PICTA, and Indigenous resistance to those. And my time at ANU overlapped with Jane Kelsey. She was there for a period and, of course, influenced some of my thinking about those. And from there, again, looking at the Indigenous resistance side, one of the things that struck me was all of the sorts of economic activities, diverse economies existing in the Pacific and here in Aotearoa that are often marginalised or invisible, not only in the kind of practices in these sorts of arrangements, but also in the the academic literature about it. And I was perturbed that within the discipline of international relations and politics where I was based, these whole worlds were absent. So after that, coming back home, a lot of my research is focused more on those other possible worlds that are already in existence, and I've been quite influenced by those in the community economy space, talking about actually if we talk more, write more, bring further to light the sorts of economies that we already have in existence, it kind of helps to proliferate those, show people that those are already viable alternatives to some of these other sorts of arrangements. And there we can think about, Māori are leading to a certain degree in some of these spaces, cooperating with other Indigenous peoples on Indigenous data sovereignty agreements, even the cooperation that we have around in the law area for bilingual, bicultural, bijural LLBs. That's in the kind of universities, has a flow-on effect to the courts, to policymakers, and those designing and participating in these. And as well as that, we already have specific relationships based in Indigenous values and principles and economies. I think Tainui had an arrangement a couple of years ago with the Squamish Nation about MOU for economic cooperation. So those sorts of things often fly under the radar, and they're kind of bound and founded in Indigenous economies and worldviews, and I think those are worth remembering. The agreements that have been talked about a lot are in the kāwanatanga space, which should be tiriti-led, but we also have our rangatiratanga sphere, which needs to be resourced, I'll come back to that, to continue the sorts of activities that Māori want to engage in directly with other Indigenous peoples, and so on. I think that's all I'm a little bit there.
Kia ora. Awesome, thank you. I guess, Risa, you've been sort of involved in this area for quite some time, and I'm just keen to hear a little bit about some of the examples in terms of some of the different ways in which Indigenous rights have been upheld or protected, and how's that working sort of from your perspective in Canada and other places where you work?
Similar, it's similar but different to the Waitangi Tribunal and the decisions that came out of that. That's also, I believe, how there was a start to looking in the international sphere of upholding Indigenous rights. Certainly in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples space, there's been a lot of work, and a lot of work has gone on for decades. So some of the great thinkers from Canada, like Sakesh Henderson, who was there, and with Moana Jackson, working on the UN Declaration many years ago. I think that space has been filled, definitely. But trade was an area which was so important to Canada, and certainly when I look back and did my research, I saw that there were former chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations making pleas for engagement, but also explaining that this is their land and you can't trade the products without involving. So both defensive and offensive positions. But that was somewhat ignored until, I would say, quite recently. And I think it's linked to the success of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada, but also to some of the work done by a First Nation out in British Columbia, Hupakasaf. They brought, working with the Council of Canadians, who is an advocacy or an activist group in trade, they brought a judicial review saying that the China-Canada investment agreement it couldn't be ratified or signed or ratified in Canada. I think it was between signature and ratification. So it couldn't be ratified in Canada because there had been no consultation in accordance with the Constitution of Canada, which recognizes Indigenous or Aboriginal rights and treaties. So the case was ultimately lost because, and interesting, the word is almost the same. They didn't see, the court said there was only a speculative link between the investment agreement and the rights of this First Nation. I think I'd like a rematch, to be honest, but what it did was it did say, the courts did agree that Indigenous peoples had to be consulted on international agreements that affected their rights. They didn't see the link here, wrong, but they did see that there were potential links with others. So that got Canada interested because they could see the writing on the wall, and suddenly there was much more involvement. There had already been some in the climate area, but I think it intensified. And in the trade area, there was suddenly quite a bit of interest starting off, I think, around 2017, when then President Trump decided, he said, no trade agreement was good. That impacts the CPTPP as well. The United States walked away from the TPP and also said, this NAFTA doesn't work for us, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that was going to be renegotiated. Canada came out with 10 separate priorities for the renegotiation of the NAFTA, one of them being an Indigenous peoples chapter, so trade and Indigenous peoples chapter. I got fortunate at that point. I was working at that time at a think tank and had written a paper based on why, had started to say, it was based on Hupakasif, looking at why there was no consultation, why that was wrong, and forget about the Constitution. That's one thing. There should definitely be more than consultation, because consultation has failed First Nations and others in Canada. Need to be participation in decision-making in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free, prior, informed consent, and that there was a failure in the trade space. And this paper set out what an Indigenous Peoples chapter could look like. At the time, frankly, I thought I was sort of pushing the envelope. 2 minutes later, it was policy, and I thought I didn't push far enough, which is too bad. But I got a chance to work with former National Chief Perry Bellegarde, working on an Indigenous Peoples chapter, taking some of the ideas in the paper and building on, of course, the ideas that was already housed within First Nations collective advocacy before, turning it into a much better precedent chapter and presenting that to Canada and saying, here's your precedent chapter. And to Canada's at that time, working with other Indigenous peoples and Indigenous Peoples Working Group, Canada did take a lot, like not everything, but to their credit, quite a bit of the ideas that were put forward by the Assembly First Nations and others into a precedent chapter. We haven't yet seen that precedent chapter. It didn't make it into the new NAFTA, the CUSMA. It's unfortunate, but not. There's three parts, and I'll just explain that, and I think it's slightly different than the chapters I'm seeing for Maori. The difference between the Canadian precedent is it sort of looks at three areas. Of course, again, the benefits and opportunities and some cooperation activities, and a strong protection of rights, which became the general exception that was included in the CUSMA or the new NAFTA. But the third piece, which I think is important, which I don't see yet in Maori chapters except for in APECTA, which is a partnership council or some other council for Indigenous peoples to sit on and influence the chapter as it's being implemented and growing. So making sure that the cooperation activities actually work, adding on to those cooperation activities and building the relationships so that Indigenous peoples can probably realize what is really wanted, and what I've heard here as well. I've heard this from my clients, Indigenous to Indigenous trade, right? But that has to start somewhere, and why not start within trade agreements? Make those rules really work for Indigenous peoples. So I think that's very important to have that council, especially if, maybe less so, and this may be why it's not in the EU or the UK agreement, who are you sitting with, right? In the EU agreement, there are the Sami, and I think the EU really should step up more for the Sami people. But for the UK, there are no Indigenous peoples left there anymore. And so that a council doesn't really work, but as a precedent, I'm glad to see it in the APECTA, and I think that's, a very key part of what should be in an Indigenous peoples chapter going forward.
Thank you, Risa. Now, Maria, would you like to make any other sort of comments in terms of some of the sort of points that Risa's raising around sort of engagement with Indigenous peoples on Indigenous free trade agreements, and how that's progressing or not? What's your view on that?
Well, I'd like to just take a step back first of all and say, what are the extent of our rights and interests? Because to me, before we rush on to the next bit, we don't have agreement on that. And I think from our tikanga Māori, our Māori is a source of our law. We have our own mana motuhake over our rohe, our kāinga, our taonga, our waterways, and so on. And we have our own rules and practices and law and politics all around that. And so, the extent of our rights and interests there, I think, are much wider than are often conceived by the kāwanatanga. We have rights stemming from te tiriti, tino rangatiratanga being a key one of those. And again, I think the view from kāwanatanga is that those rights are, I think, often smaller than we, as many of our hapu and iwi, conceive of them to be. We also have rights, these minimum standards set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I think that's an important starting point in thinking about, when at that very base level about, what are at the extent of our rights and interests, we're having an expectation that they're much broader, and the Crown is seeking in our domestic sphere, and then, in all sorts of other arrangements, to limit those and really contest those sorts of rights, I think, and control resources and the ownership of resources. I think that's where some of the difficulties start before we even get to the next bits. I think the other important point to make there is that the burden for engaging in these activities does fall to hapu and iwi, and so resourcing rangatiratanga, the rangatiratanga sphere, I think, is really important, and that was something I was going to talk about further on, but I'll say it now, is that that's a real conundrum, I think, for many Māori, is how to participate in these sorts of agreements and analysing texts and so on, and also balance our time with strengthening the rangatiratanga sphere. I think, we've all seen the diagram from He Puapua now, the tiny little itsy bitsy rangatiratanga sphere and the overlarge kāwanatanga sphere. How do we get to be of equal size if our energies keep getting drained into the kāwanatanga sphere to, raise their capacity? There do need to be tiriti-led processes there and in the relational sphere, but we also need to actively resource the rangatiratanga sphere to be able to stand in an equal size and power, and I think that's important. If I just then segue to the agreements, I think, again, to me, an important point about thinking, how can these agreements uphold our rights? Well, they were never designed to protect or uphold Indigenous people's rights, and I'm mihi to those who are trying to, enable them to develop and have this phased approach to something better. But at the heart of the kind of philosophical, perspective of these is assumptions about people, that we're individual, self-maximising, selfish individuals, that markets have a particular efficiency and are the best place to govern all sorts of activities that were previously governed in other ways, or in Indigenous communities that continue to be governed in other ways. Ideas that the state is inefficient and should just be, have this minimal role. So I think we shouldn't forget that baked into these are assumptions about Indigenous peoples having lesser forms of law, lesser forms of political economies, and in fact needing some civilising by this market mechanism. So we should, I think, keep those limitations of the philosophical underpinnings of these agreements. They're set up to privilege transnational corporations, and their very creation is on the back of Indigenous marginalisation over the world. But also that parallel history of sustained political initiatives that Indigenous peoples are engaged in to pursue their own visions and political economies. So I think with enormous amounts of effort from Indigenous peoples, they can be tinkered with and improved. And again, I mihi to those who are involved in that work. But it's a hard slog, and they're not neutral processes. And I think keeping that kind of world view is key.
Cool. Oh, I guess. I don't know if this is in the script or not, but just thinking about what kinds of, what would an ideal sort of situation look like in terms of if we were moving away from, the struggles and the sort of the resource constraints and the demands that are placed upon Indigenous peoples to, engage with free trade agreements and all these sort of things. What would the opposite look like? What would the sort of ideal look like in terms of a more sort of partnership-based approach to engaging with Indigenous peoples on these trade agreements? And
I'm going to try to answer that question,
yeah.
but with talking about something I think that's really standing in the way to the ideal relationship, and I think this fits on very nicely to everything you just spoke about, Maria. Is this same issues that you're trying to fit into something that's already there. And I think also trade agreements themselves have changed. At the beginning, they were about tariffs. And we heard today, lowering tariffs and making sure goods can go, those are good things. But trade agreements became something more. They started reaching into the sphere of our lives and changing them, having impacts on the environment, public health and safety. And I'll call villain to that, and we talked about that yesterday, is the investor-state dispute settlement. And I think having investor-state dispute settlement in progressive and or inclusive with inclusive trade, it's the antithesis of inclusive trade, right? Because again, you are elevating, and unfortunately here I'm actually quoting my Deputy Prime Minister, elevating the rights of corporations over sovereign governments, and certainly elevating those rights over the rights of Indigenous peoples. And why is it so important? Because the clashes are happening over the use of land. And it's not going to get better. I think it's going to get even worse with critical minerals. Where are these critical minerals located? Certainly, so in Canada, where are these critical minerals located? They're located in traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, unceded lands of Indigenous peoples. It's going to be an even bigger problem. And so this was, I thought, maybe recognized with the negotiation of the new NAFTA, the CUSMA. It was decided between Canada and the United States. They would no longer have ISDS between them. They did continue with Mexico. I think it's actually June 30th is going to be the end of the legacy period of NAFTA claims, and no time too soon, because there's been a few that have been launched over the past couple of weeks. One of them, an important one that affects, I think, Indigenous rights in Canada is called Ruby River. So these claims are very impactful, and my concern is with the United Kingdom coming into the CPTPP, most of the headquarters of oil and gas and other extractive companies are in London. So that means there's a lot of UK investors who will want to expand into the different countries in CPTPP. And so New Zealand has taken a position to have a side letter with the UK, as has Australia, and the language is disallow the ISDS provisions. That's great when it comes to the UK. Canada has not done that. So that's very problematic, I believe, for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So we're getting rid of one problem, the NAFTA, and replacing it with an equally big problem, the CPTPP and the ISDS there. It's called Chapter 11 in NAFTA, so now it's going to be whatever the chapter's called in CPTPP. Everybody will soon be talking about it. I'm not sure why there's not more pushback in Canada. I think it does seem people are sort of shrugging, saying, well, it was already there in the CP, and what's the problem with the UK joining? They're not even in the Pacific. So who could have seen that happening, right? We talk about the Pacific Islands saying, why isn't the trade here? Well, it's very interesting the UK has invited themselves to a party that they weren't especially supposed to be. And they're bringing, I would say, a big problem with them. So moving forward, as we're talking about what ITAG can do, what the CPTPP review can do, we need to, I think, one, have a stronger general exception in the CPTPP. So good that there's a Treaty of Waitangi exception, but we've talked about how there are limits to that. So I think we should be looking, and the new language that New Zealand has worked on with Maori looks much stronger. It's somewhat similar to what's in the CUSMA now. So a stronger general exception needs to be there. Yes, that's one, but that's not the solution. The solution is no ISDS. And although we may not be able to talk all the countries out of it, all the countries that are part of ITAG should be moving forward with their joint declaration on inclusive trade and noting that they will not have ISDS between them. And Canada really the mirror has to be held up to Canada. They're talking out of two sides of their mouth. They're pushing, I believe, my understanding is they're the ones who brought the CP into the CPTPP and wanted to have progressive there, and then went ahead and, just pushed ISDS, and they're one of the champions of it. And why? Mining companies. We have tons of mining companies, and they are causing havoc across the world. They are the worst. It's Canada, a country where, again, the reputation of being clean and environmental, that's going, we won't be seen as green too much longer because all the trees are on fire. But the work that internationally we're doing with mining companies is, it's a stain on the reputation of Canadians. And I believe that we need to really use this opportunity of the ITAG review and the CPTPP review to at least make sure that the ITAG countries won't have CPTPP, won't have ISDS between them, and Canada also, and this is just a minute longer. So working with the Assembly of First Nations and the Indigenous Working Group, we worked on the general exception to make sure that it was in the CUSMA, and Canada's, they haven't taken the stand as strong as I'd like, but the idea is it's going to be in every other trade agreement, this general exception. Also, the same language and other progressive language has been put in a model investment agreement, so protecting somewhat Indigenous rights, further ISDS if Canada enters into the model agreement. So 5 years of this work, and what does Canada do? It says, oh, we'll just, we're just going to go forward with ISDS with the UK. They're right now, again, similar to New Zealand, are negotiating a bilateral agreement. So they could have chosen the path of, if they wanted to have ISDS so badly, they could have used the general exception that they worked on in good faith with Indigenous peoples. They could have used the new model language that also goes quite a bit farther to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in the bilateral, and with the CPTPP entered into a side letter. Certainly they could have done that. That was available to them. I don't understand the position that's been taken. I feel that the heart is a real step backwards to the work that Canada has done, and it is very problematic. So, and why this is also important, so there is a side letter that New Zealand has with the UK, or will have with the UK. There is side letters with some other countries. They don't have a side letter with Canada. So Canadian companies can bring claims here, and all you have is the Treaty of Waitangi exception, which we've already discussed is probably not going to be that effective. There's an ISDS claim. So a lot of work needs to be done, and something I want to bring to everyone's attention as we're discussing this. I'm very positive about some of the work. As I started off positive, here's all the good work that we had done, but that good work with ISDS in trade agreements can all be undone with just one claim, the bad faith, and it will also, I think, turn, if First Nations rights are threatened by these claims, they're not going to want to sit at tables and talk about how trade is inclusive. Okay, thank you.
So I just wanted to, I'm glad you raised the critical minerals issue. It was something I was going to raise also. I mean, we are in a climate crisis, and thank you for reminding us that, and there are concerns there, and I think what we can see happening, again, reminds us, what sorts of entities are getting privileged in these kinds of arrangements, transnational corporations. And so when it comes to mining, I'm the minerals advisor for our hapu Ngāti Kia, Ngāti Tuara, and so what we're seeing in our area, which is at Horohoro, South Rotorua, is companies, so billion-dollar multinational mining companies coming now looking for lithium and rare earth minerals. So they've pivoted and have greenwashed themselves from the other sorts of devastating mining activities that they've been engaged in previously, and now picking up on this kind of green energy economy and trying to pursue the same sorts of extractive activities, also using mechanisms. And I think it's important to remember that the word trade often confuses people. We're talking about capital flows as well, and I think so those billion-dollar mining companies are then able to come. And so when I think about the power dynamic there, so I'm the minerals advisor, I have to engage with representatives from this company to talk about, well, our perspective as a hapu is that we continue to have mana over those minerals in the ground and our rohe, and don't want them to come and have open cast mines in our area. We're interested in a different sort of degrowth, I might say, but a different sort of future, one where we have a flourishing and abundant taiao, where we're in good relationship with each other, tangata whenua, tangata tiriti, and papatuanuku. And so that doesn't stem from these sorts of encouragements for foreign direct investment or capital flows. The other really clear example that we've had, and I think the loophole on this has only been closed recently, was this intentional mechanism that was set up to encourage foreign direct investment. We know the government wanted the planting, the afforestation of a whole lot of large tracts in the country. So they created a mechanism to enable and encourage foreign direct investment. And I know Wayne Mulligan will be keen on those pine trees, but it meant that fund managers, financiers, those pension funds from other places came and invested and bought huge areas of our land and then put it into pines to get the carbon credits. And they took it's the same extractive process, take all of that profit offshore. Means for us as hapu and iwi, the price of the land has suddenly skyrocketed. There's no employment into the economy there, except perhaps the chemical things that Wayne Mulligan's involved in, but not in the local economy, and you've got this kind of extractive process, and that's all about encouraging foreign direct investment, seeing that, and it's a particular sort of investment that they're after and development. And so when we think of, you asked what our vision was, well, if it is this flourishing, abundant taiao, our good relationships, that comes from somewhere else. That means we need to foster our relationships in good faith, resourcing our rangatiratanga sphere, supporting those renewable activities, energy activities that might be smaller scale, are cooperatives, not necessarily capitalist forms. That's the other possible world, I think, that counterbalances the climate crisis we're in, and the global economy is in this crisis also. So, and has produced the dire straits we're in. So we can't keep repeating that. So building up this other way of being, I think, is definitely the answer.
Awesome. I think we're getting close to the end of our panel. Five minutes. So I just wanted to ask the kaupapa of this conference is advancing aspirations for Indigenous self-determination and well-being, and can CPTPP help? So I just wanted to ask for your sort of views on that statement and how far we are, or where we're at in relation to that sort of question, and where we need to be and what we can do to sort of get there.
I think if the CPTPP can get closer when it comes to the work that IPECTA has done, CPTPP was signed. I now call it an old agreement when it comes to an old, it's like the NAFTA beforehand, and there are some provisions in there that are useful. Certainly, set asides. We talked about procurement. Procurement is going to be it's very important for First Nations and other Indigenous businesses in Canada. So there are some definitely useful provisions. And there's some environmental provisions that are useful, but it needs, I think, to be brought forward into the sphere we're talking about now with Indigenous trade. I think we need to start looking at what's in IPECTA and how we get that in the CPTPP if we're having reviews. But mainly a general exception, I think, is definitely missing to cover all Indigenous peoples, not just Maori, and also elevate the general exception so that it's stronger and gets rid of the problems that the Waitangi Tribunal. I've definitely spoken about ISDS. I don't think it belongs in the CPTPP. I don't think ISDS belongs in any agreement that wants to be inclusive. So I think the review is there, but certainly when you're talking about what has it done, I think we heard that this morning from Fingalis. It's very impressive with the getting rid of the tariffs. And I don't think getting rid of the tariffs is the problem. That's definitely the positive. It's the other chapters that need to have the same sort of ambition with the work, the economic prosperity that's being brought to businesses is great, but you're leaving out the other areas, which is the participation in decision-making. What do Indigenous peoples want themselves in the agreement? Giving them a space within the agreement, hopefully, as we've discussed, change it to make it work more for them. It may not be perfect, but maybe that's something that could happen, as well, fixing the ISDS problem.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at making it compliant with the UNDRIP and see what, as John Burrows has suggested in other places, and how that would, set those minimum standards into it. But I think the other part of it is resourcing the rangatiratanga sphere, so that, we can have this more equitable engagement, not in the kind of drip feeding way. And there are some Māori scholars, Matt Scobie being one of them, doing some research on actually what does resourcing rangatiratanga at a more fundamental level look like, rather than just receiving grants as in an ad hoc kind of way. I think that enables a better tiriti-led relationship. You've been given a mic.
I mean, that was going to be my question. What does resourcing of rangatiratanga look like? Has Matt come up with any sort of...
Well, he has actually. He's been looking at levies, and he's from Ngaitahu, and I know Ngaitahu's been doing a lot of work with trips to Canada to look at the tax authorities that they have there. So really sharing the resources at a more fundamental level. And we know the Kāwanatanga has assumed the right to tax everyone and extract the resources and monopolise them. But actually, if they're shared at that more fundamental level, I think that's quite key.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our panel, but I just want to thank you both for your amazing contribution to this whole work over many years, but also for today. We've just been blessed with your presence and your whakaaro, so thank you very much on behalf of our conference. Kia ora.
Kia ora.